Whispers in the dark, the rain drummed against the windows of Riverside Children's Home, like restless fingers, creating a rhythm that seemed to match Nora Blackwood's nervous heartbeat. She clutched a worn leather satchel filled with picture books, her knuckles white against the handle. At 28, she had spent most of her adult life surrounded by books in the quiet sanctuary of the city library. But children were an entirely different story. "Don't worry, dear," Mrs. Caldwell said, her silver hair catching the lamplight as she led Nora down the narrow hallway. "They can sense fear, but they can also sense kindness. And you have plenty of the latter." The elderly director's eyes twinkled. With the wisdom of someone who had dedicated her life to healing broken spirits, the common room buzzed with subdued energy. A dozen children, ranging from toddlers to preteens, sat scattered across mismatched furniture. Some played quietly with toys, others stared out the rain-streaked windows, and a few simply sat in that particular stillness that comes from experiencing too much too young. "Children," Mrs. Caldwell announced gently, "this is Miss Nora. She's brought some stories to share with you." Most of the children glanced up briefly before returning to their activities, but one small boy in the corner remained perfectly motionless. He appeared to be about 7, with dark hair that fell across his eyes and clothes that seemed too big for his slight frame. Something about his absolute stillness made Nora's heart ache. "That's Finn," Mrs. Caldwell whispered. "He came to us 3 months ago. Hasn't spoken a word since." She paused, her expression growing tender. "His grandmother raised him after his parents died, but when she passed last spring, there was no one else." Nora nodded, understanding immediately. She had been that quiet child once, after her own parents' accident when she was 9. Had been her refuge then, stories her companions, when human connection felt too dangerous. She settled into the circle of children, cross-legged on the worn carpet, and pulled out her first book. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice soft but clear, "in a forest where the trees whispered secrets to the wind, ... double quotes, as she read, something magical began to happen. The restless energy in the room gradually stilled. Children who had been fidgeting drew closer. Even the teenagers who had initially rolled their eyes found themselves listening. Caught up in Nora's gentle cadence and the way she brought each character to vivid life with subtle changes in her voice, but it was Finn who captured her attention most. Though he remained in his corner, she noticed his head tilt slightly toward her voice. When she glanced in his direction during particularly exciting moments in the story, she caught the faintest spark of interest in his dark eyes. After the first story ended, a little girl named Ruby tugged on Nora's sleeve. "Can you read another one, please?" Of course, Nora smiled, reaching for a second book. As she did, she noticed Finn had moved closer, though still maintaining his distance. It was the smallest of victories, but it filled her with hope. The second story was about a lonely lighthouse keeper who discovered that his light guided more than just ships to safety. As Nora read about the keeper's realization that even in his solitude he was connected to others, she found her gaze drifting to Finn. This time, when their eyes met briefly, he didn't look away immediately. When the session ended and the children were shepherded off to bed, Mrs. Caldwell approached Nora with a smile. "That was beautiful, dear. I haven't seen them that engaged in months. Will you come back tomorrow?" "Yes," Nora said without hesitation, already planning which stories she would bring next. As she gathered her books, she looked back at the corner where Finn had been sitting. He was gone, but somehow she knew he had been listening to every word. Walking home through the rain-soaked streets, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Shadows behind walls, Julian Cross stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city lights blur through the rain. At 34, he had built an empire from code and algorithms, but tonight, like every night for the past 2 years, sleep eluded him. The digital clock on his desk glowed 11:47 p.m., mocking his exhaustion. "Mr. Cross?" Marcus Chen, his assistant, peered through the office doorway. "The car is ready for your visit to Riverside." Julian nodded without turning around. These late-night inspections had become routine since he'd begun his anonymous donations to the children's home. 6 months ago, he told himself it was due diligence, ensuring his money was being used properly. The truth was more complicated. 20 minutes later, Julian's black sedan pulled up to the modest brick building that housed Riverside Children's Home. The structure was old, but well-maintained, its windows glowing warmly against the night. Mrs. Caldwell had left him a key, and detailed reports of the renovations his donations had funded: new heating systems, dated kitchen equipment, fresh paint throughout. He moved through the building like a ghost, checking contractors' work and reviewing progress. The silence usually comforted him, but tonight something was different. As he approached the children's wing to inspect the new lighting fixtures, he heard a voice drifting from the common room. The dragon wasn't cruel because he was born evil, the voice said, soft and melodious. He was cruel because he had forgotten what it felt like to be loved. Julian froze in the hallway. Should leave. Respect the children's bedtime routine. But something about the voice held him captive. It carried a quality he hadn't heard in years: genuine warmth, the kind that didn't want anything in return. Through the partially open door, he could see a woman sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by children in pajamas. Her auburn hair caught the lamplight as she gestured expressively, bringing the story to life. The children hung on her. Every word, even the older ones, who usually affected teenage indifference. But then the woman continued. A little girl appeared at the dragon's cave. She wasn't afraid of his roar or his flames. Instead, she sat down and said, "You must be." So tired of being angry all the time, Julian found himself leaning against the wall, drawn into the tale despite himself. The storyteller's voice painted pictures more vivid than any screen he'd ever coded. He watched as she made eye contact with each child, including a small boy in the corner who seemed to absorb every word, though he remained perfectly still. Dragon was so surprised by her kindness that his flames turned into tears. For the first time in 100 years, someone sat with him while he cried. Something twisted in Julian's chest. He pressed his back against the hallway wall, overwhelmed by emotions he'd spent 2 years trying to suppress. The story wasn't just about a dragon, it was about him. About anyone who had built walls so high they forgot there was a world beyond them. And what happened next? One of the children whispered. The dragon learned that healing doesn't happen overnight, the woman said gently. But with patience and kindness, even the most broken hearts can learn to love again. Julian closed his eyes, his breath coming short. These were just words, just a children's story. But they seemed to reach through his carefully constructed armor and touch something he thought he'd buried forever. The session ended with quiet murmurs and the shuffle of small feet heading to bed. Julian waited until the sounds faded before moving toward the exit. But not before catching a glimpse of the storyteller as she packed up her books. She moved with the same gentle care she'd shown in her voice, treating each book like a treasured friend. Back in his car, Julian sat in the darkness long after Marcus had started the engine. "Sir, shall I take you home?" "Who is she?" Julian asked quietly. Marcus consulted his tablet, understanding immediately. "Nora Blackwood, sir? She's been volunteering for 2 weeks. Head librarian at the downtown branch. No family. Lives alone in a small apartment near the University District." Julian nodded, filing away the information. As the car pulled away from Riverside, he found himself already planning his return. For the first time in months, he looked forward to tomorrow night. But as they drove through the empty streets, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The dragon in the story had been transformed by unexpected kindness. Julian wondered if he was brave enough to find out what that might feel like. The city lights blurred past his window as he made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow night, he would listen again. The listener's secret 3 weeks had passed since Julian first heard Nora's voice, and his nightly visits to Riverside had become as essential as breathing. He arrived precisely at 8:30 p.m., positioning himself in the same spot in the hallway, where the acoustics carried her voice perfectly. Marcus had stopped questioning these visits. Though Julian caught his concerned glances in the rearview mirror, tonight felt different. As Julian settled into his familiar position against the wall, he noticed the children seemed more animated than usual. Even Finn, the quiet boy who had captured Julian's attention during previous sessions, sat closer to the circle than ever before. Tonight, Nora announced, her voice carrying that special warmth Julian had come to crave. "I want to tell you about a tree that grew in the most unlikely place." Julian closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. He had learned to recognize the subtle changes in her tone, the way she adapted each story to the mood of her audience. She had an uncanny ability to sense what the children needed to hear. "This tree grew in the middle of a busy city," Nora continued, "right through the cracks in the concrete sidewalk. Everyone said it shouldn't be there, that it couldn't possibly survive in such a harsh place. But the little tree had a secret. I too knew that even the smallest roots could find water. And even in darkness, there was always a way toward the light." Julian found himself thinking of his own childhood. Growing up in foster homes after his parents' death in a factory accident, it had been that unlikely tree, thriving despite the odds, building his company from nothing. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten about reaching toward the light. The tree grew taller and stronger. Nora's voice continued, and something wonderful happened. The tree's roots had broken up the hard concrete, creating space for flowers and grass. What had once been an ugly, empty corner became a small garden. "Did people notice?" asked Ruby, one of the regular listeners. "They did," Nora smiled, and Julian could hear it in her voice even from the hallway. "And they began to take better care of that corner. They watered the plants and kept the area clean." The tree had turned a forgotten place into something beautiful. Julian opened his eyes, struck by the metaphor. Through his donations, he had been trying to fix Riverside from a distance, but Nora was doing something entirely different. She was creating growth from within, nurturing something that would spread naturally. "But the most amazing part," Nora said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made everyone lean in, "was that the tree was never really alone, even when it felt like it was growing in isolation. Its roots were connected to an entire underground network. Every tree, every plant in the city was part of the same web of life." Julian felt something crack open in his chest. For 2 years he had convinced himself that isolation was strength, that needing others was weakness. But listening to Nora night after night, he was beginning to understand that connection wasn't a liability, it was what made survival meaningful. "I like that story," came a small, clear voice. The hallway fell silent. Julian held his breath, recognizing something momentous was happening. Nora's voice was barely above a whisper, filled with wonder and joy. "Did you just speak?" "The tree was brave," Finn said, his voice growing slightly stronger, "even when it was scary to grow." Julian pressed his back against the wall, overwhelmed by emotion. He had witnessed this child's first words in months, this breakthrough that Nora had patiently, lovingly created. Through the crack in the door, he could see her kneeling beside Finn, tears streaming down her face, as she whispered, taking Finn's small hand in hers. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is keep growing, even when we're afraid." The other children erupted in gentle celebration, and Julian watched as Finn actually smiled, for the first time since he'd been observing these sessions. The boy's transformation was miraculous, but it was Nora's face that undid Julian completely. She looked at Finn with such pure joy, such unconditional love. Julian felt his own carefully constructed walls crumbling as the children were led off to bed. Chattering excitedly about Finn's breakthrough, Julian remained frozen in the hallway. He had come here originally to oversee his investment, then to find some peace in Nora's stories. But now he understood the truth. He had been coming here to remember what it felt like to be human. Marcus found him there 20 minutes later, still leaning against the wall with tears on his cheeks. "Sir, are you all right?" Julian wiped his face and straightened his jacket, but for once, he didn't feel the need to completely hide his emotions. "I'm better than I've been in a very long time, Marcus." As they walked toward the exit, Julian made a decision. Tomorrow night, he wouldn't just listen from the shadows. It was time to step into the light, even if it meant risking the peace he had found in anonymity. Nora's stories had taught him that growth required courage, and Julian was finally ready to be brave. The unlikely tree in her story had created space for others to flourish. Perhaps it was time for Julian to do the same. When worlds collide, the afternoon sun filtered through the maple trees in Riverside's small garden, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden benches. Nora sat with a book in her lap, but her attention was focused on Finn, who crouched nearby examining a cluster of dandelions growing through the fence. 3 days had passed since his breakthrough, and he had been speaking in whispers, sharing observations about everything from cloud shapes to the way light moved across walls. "Miss Nora," he said softly, holding up a dandelion, "this one grew in a crack, just like the tree in your story." "You're absolutely right," Nora smiled, her heart swelling with pride at his progress. "What do you think that means?" Finn considered. This seriously, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Maybe beautiful things can grow anywhere if they try hard enough." "That's very wise," came a voice from behind them. Nora turned to see a man standing at the garden entrance, and her breath caught slightly. He was tall and lean, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and the kind of deep exhaustion in his eyes that she recognized from her work with the children. His expensive clothes seemed at odds with the weariness in his posture, as if success couldn't quite mask whatever pain he carried. Finn immediately moved closer to Nora, his newfound confidence still fragile around strangers. She placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," the man said, noticing Finn's retreat. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just... I heard what he said about things growing in unexpected places. It's a beautiful observation." "Are you here to see Mrs. Caldwell?" Nora asked, though something about him seemed familiar in a way she couldn't place. "Actually," he said, settling onto a bench across from them with careful, non-threatening movements, "I was hoping to meet you. I'm Julian." He didn't offer a last name, and Nora found herself grateful for the simplicity. If there was something raw and unguarded about him that reminded her of the children she worked with, someone who had been hurt and was trying to find his way back to trust. "I'm Nora," she said, studying his face. "Are you thinking about volunteering? We can always use more help." Lean almost smiled at that, a ghost of warmth crossing his features. "I'm not sure I'd be very good with children. I haven't been around them much." "Neither was I at first," Nora admitted. "But they have a way of teaching you what they need." Finn, who had been watching Julian with curious eyes, suddenly spoke up. "You look sad like I was sad." The directness of the observation made Julian's breath catch. He looked at this small boy who had somehow seen straight through him, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure wavered. "I suppose I have been," Julian said quietly. "For a long time." "Miss Nora's stories help," Finn said matter-of-factly. "They help me remember how to talk." Julian's eyes widened slightly, and Nora saw recognition flicker across his face. "You're the boy who spoke for the first time a few nights ago," he said softly. Nora felt a chill of realization. How could you possibly know that? Julian was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, he met her eyes directly. "Because I was there. Not in the room, but I've been listening." From the hallway. The admission hung in the air between them. Nora felt a mix of emotion, surprise, curiosity, and something else she couldn't quite name. "You've been listening to the stories?" "Every night for 3 weeks," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know how that sounds, but I didn't mean to intrude. Just..." He struggled for words, then seemed to give up on explanation. "Your stories, they've been the only thing that helps me sleep. The only thing that makes the world feel... possible again," Nora studied his face, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. She thought of all the nights she had sensed someone beyond her immediate audience, feeling like her words were reaching further than just the children in the room. "You've been my invisible audience," she said softly. "I felt it sometimes, like the stories were meant for someone else too." "I lost someone," Julian said suddenly, the words seeming to escape without his permission, 2 years ago. "What? I haven't been able to. I've forgotten how to be around people. But listening to you talk about healing and second chances and broken, things becoming beautiful again." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been like remembering that there's still good in the world." Finn, who had been listening with the intense focus children bring to adult emotions they don't fully understand, suddenly moved closer to Julian. "Do you want to sit with us while Miss Nora reads? Sometimes being sad together is better than being sad alone." The simple wisdom of the offer broke something open in Julian's expression. He looked at this small boy who had invited him into their circle without question, then at Nora, who was watching him with the same gentle acceptance she showed all her broken spirits. "I would like that very much," Julian said, his voice unsteady. As the three of them settled together on the garden bench, Nora opened her book and began to read. But this time, she wasn't just reading to the children inside or the lonely listener in the hallway. She was reading to someone who had finally found the courage to step into the light. And somehow, that made all the difference. The afternoon. Sun continued its journey across the sky, but in that small garden, time seemed suspended. Three people who had found each other in the most unexpected way sat together, connected by stories and the quiet understanding that healing was possible, even for hearts that had forgotten how to hope. Stories that heal 6 months later. Nora stood in what had once been an empty warehouse, watching as volunteers arranged colorful cushions and bookshelves throughout the transformed space. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the hand-painted murals that depicted scenes from beloved children's stories. The Story Haven, as Finn had named it, was nearly ready for its grand opening. "The sound system is working perfectly," Julian said, approaching from the small stage area where he had been testing equipment. Gone was the exhausted, isolated man she had met in the garden. While he would never be someone who thrived in crowds, there was a warmth in his eyes now, a sense of purpose that had replaced the desperate emptiness. "I still can't believe you did all this," Nora said, gesturing around the space. The revelation of Julian's identity as the mysterious donor had come gradually. In quiet conversations over shared meals and long walks through the city, she had been shocked, yes, but more importantly, she had seen that beneath the wealth and success was simply a person who had learned to give love through action when words felt too dangerous. "We did this," Julian corrected gently, a habit he had developed over the months. "Your vision, remember, just provided the means." The Story Haven was more than either of them had initially imagined. What had started as Julian's desire to expand Nora's storytelling program had evolved into a comprehensive center for narrative therapy. Children from all the city's care facilities would come for programs. But so would adults dealing with trauma, elderly residents of nursing homes, and anyone who needed to remember that their story mattered. "Miss Nora, Mr. Julian," Finn's voice carried across the space as he ran toward them, his arms full of books. At 8 years old, he had grown taller and more confident, though he still preferred quiet conversations to large groups. "Mrs. Caldwell says the bus from Riverside is almost here. You ready for your debut as assistant storyteller?" Nora asked, ruffling his hair. Finn nodded solemnly. He had been practicing for weeks, preparing to help with the younger children, while Nora worked with different age groups. "I picked out the story about the lighthouse," he said. "The one about how sometimes you can't see how much good you're doing." Julian knelt down to Finn's eye level. "That's a perfect choice." "Remember what we talked about? That everyone has a story worth telling," Finn recited, "and everyone deserves someone who will listen." It had become their informal motto, carved into a wooden sign above the entrance. Julian had suggested the words during one of their planning sessions, and Nora had immediately known they captured everything they were trying to build. As the first groups of children began arriving, chattering excitedly as they explored the new space, Julian found himself marveling at the transformation, not just of the warehouse, but of his own life. The insomnia that had plagued him for years had gradually faded as he found purpose beyond profit margins and growth strategies. He still ran his tech company, but now it felt like just one part of a fuller existence. "Julian," Nora said quietly, touching his arm as they watched Finn guide a group of wide-eyed 5-year-olds to the picture book section. "Thank you, not just for this place, but for trusting me with your story too." Over the months, Julian had slowly shared pieces of his past, the son he had lost to a rare genetic condition, the guilt he carried for all the bedtime stories he had been too busy to read, the way Nora's voice in that hallway had reminded him what love sounded like. In return, Nora had shared her own history of loss and healing, the way books had saved her after her parents' death, and how working with broken children had taught her that wholeness wasn't about never being damaged. It was about finding ways to let light shine through the cracks. "I should be thanking you," Julian said. "You gave me back my life." As the afternoon unfolded, the Story Haven filled with laughter and wonder. Nora moved between groups like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of voices, while Julian found himself naturally gravitating toward the quieter children. The ones who reminded him of himself or Finn. He was still learning, still sometimes uncertain, but Nora's gentle encouragement had taught him that imperfection was not disqualifying, it was human. During a break between sessions, Mrs. Caldwell approached them with tears in her eyes. "You know," she said, "in 40 years of this work, I've seen many generous donations and well-meaning programs. But I've never seen anything transform lives quite like this. You've created something that heals the healers too." As evening approached, and the last of the visitors departed, Julian, Nora, and Finn found themselves alone in the peaceful space. They settled into the main reading circle, surrounded by the lingering warmth of the day's connections. "So," Nora said, opening one of Finn's favorite books, "shall we start our own tradition? The first of many stories in this place." "Once upon a time," Julian said, surprising them both by speaking first, "there was a man who forgot how to hope, a woman who remembered how to heal, and a little boy who taught them both that courage sounds like a whisper that refuses to be silenced." Finn giggled. "That's not how stories start, isn't it?" Nora asked, her eyes meeting Julian's across the circle. "I think that's exactly how the best stories begin." Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, but inside the story haven, three people who had found each other in the most unexpected way created their own quiet revolution. They had learned that stories don't just entertain, they connect, they heal. They remind us that no one is truly alone as long as someone is willing to listen. And in the months and years that followed, that lesson would ripple outward, touching countless lives throughout the city and beyond. Because sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simplest act. One person caring enough to tell a story, and another brave enough to listen.